Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be working on Unit 1 here, and we're going to begin by talking about the piece of software that we need to do our work here in class. And I've done some pre-announcements for the course in which I kind of gave you a little bit of a heads up, and then also talked about it before the syllabus and kind of during the syllabus. Um, the fact that we will be using Microsoft's Visual Studio as our IDE for this course. And in fact, the stuff that we need to do um, doesn't, when you think about all the other stuff that you've learned, so I'm backtracking here a bit again, think of all the languages that you've learned, you know, over the course of the last year or so being in these programs, where many of them were really pretty platform agnostic. So like when you're doing web pages or Java code or whatever, it doesn't matter what machine you're on, what OS or anything, and in fact, in many cases, you can do the work on really slow old machines and it still works. But now we're moving to using Visual Studio, and Visual Studio, in order to do the things that we need to do in this class, does require that we're on a Windows machine that does have certain capabilities. The general rule of thumb, by the way, is a minimum of 8 gigs of RAM, and I'm hoping all of you are 16 or more at this point. A modern CPU, and I would call a modern CPU probably like at least an i5 and at least at like 2 to 3 gigahertz, somewhere in that range, something that can churn out some processing power. And I always recommend an SSD for a hard drive if possible. And my minimum hard drive recommendation is 500 gig. Functionally for myself, I can't operate with less than a terabyte usually. So, but you want to have plenty of room. And as we mentioned before, Visual Studio is going to require, with the tools that we need, 30 to 40 gig. Now we'll see that as we actually do the install, what the actual size count is. I'm really curious to see how it changes, because it does change over time. But let's talk about where do we get this product from, right? And there's a couple of different ways to get it. The easiest and my recommended way to do it is actually just to go search it, right? So I'm just going to type Visual Studio here at the prompt. And now some of you might be saying to yourselves in the back of your head, oh, Ty, I've got this covered. I've got Visual Studio Code installed. And I'm going to say, oh, that's very nice, but that's wrong, right? So that's like not the right piece of software. And I'm not putting the software down. It's just a lightweight version. It is like, it's kind of like driving a golf cart and then jumping in like a sports car. It's kind of like the difference. Visual Studio Code is a fine editor, and you can see here on the Microsoft website that they basically have Visual Studio broken down into 3 development paths here. And you'll notice that some of you, depending on what, way you studied or what tools you prefer to use in other classes, many of you downloaded and installed Visual Studio Code. And this is the tool that's multi-platform. So this works on Windows, Linux, and the Mac OS, no problem. And in fact, on both the Linux and Mac OS, it actually is my coding tool of choice most of the time, because there's not as many good choices for those platforms. Now you will notice that they have a full-blown Mac version as well, but it is limited so that it can author successfully to platform neutral technologies. Or like if you are working on the Mac, you can author for iOS, right? So which you can't natively usually do in Visual Studio necessarily. That's not necessarily true either, though. And then for basically a bunch of other open platforms. However, this version does not include the tools that we need for this class. And therefore is kind of off the table. So folks, we cannot use a Linux machine and we cannot use a Mac machine. Those of you on those platforms must find a way to either virtualize the OS or the application within your OS. But the strong recommendation is that you, probably get a machine that actually runs the OS for best performance and experience. I have seen people, like, for example, on a Mac run like Parallels Desktop, or I forget what the other virtualization platforms are on the Mac for the moment, they escape me. And while they're running the Mac OS, and it's okay. And I've seen people do it on Linux too, where they'll run like VirtualBox or VMware or something and be able to run Windows. But it kind of frustrating because you're not operating Notepad at this point. You're operating something a lot more robust, and it really does need a lot more horsepower. So if you're downloading from here, you then, obviously you're going to need the Windows version, which is the first one listed. And as you hit the download button here and hover, you'll notice that they have three different versions. Now, some of you, and I'm going to pause here in just a second and ask the question, may already have one of these versions installed on your machine. And I want to know that as we go in. And I want to know which of these versions you have installed. And what I'm going to recommend to you personally, and so those of you that want to get started on this can actually click the button and follow through, is for people who are doing this, this is not technically a free product at all. So if you use the professional or enterprise versions, this software is actually quite expensive. And when you stop being a student and keep using the product, and they want you to license it, well, then all of a sudden, the bill comes due. And so what I often recommend to students is stay away from the Pro and Enterprise version, uh, frankly, because you don't want that license to expire. Okay, so let's kind of fill in the blank here, though. There are ways for you as a student to get licenses for those. And in fact, if you are part of the software developer program, they're probably running, I'm thinking the enterprise, at least the pro version, but probably the enterprise version in the software developer program. And they do run it fully licensed, and you can get a license key from the Azure cloud, which I'm about to show you how to do. But if you were just like off the street, you weren't a gateway student, you want to learn how to do Visual Studio, you want to learn how to do this stuff, I would go to the community version. And the reason is all that it requires to unlock it is some sort of Microsoft login. And I want you to think about that. So you may already have an Xbox account or a Microsoft Mail account like Live Mail or Outlook or something like that, or you have maybe a regular Windows PC that uses your email address to log into Windows. And in that case, you already have an account. All you have to do is sign in, and you have access to the product and any of the upgrades that come. And it's free. And this is, frankly, a radical departure for Microsoft. In the past, they never did that, right? They would give it to students for free, and then everybody else got like a 30-day trial, and then it's like, hands out, pay me, kind of thing. But they got pretty smart, and what they started seeing, I think, is that people were like, well, if I'm learning how to code, why should I even bother with Microsoft then? Because I got to pay all this money. Forget it. I can do the stuff over here, and it's still as cool. Um, and so by giving out a free version, what they've done is they've pulled a lot of people back to their tools. So they started giving away the community version, which is free, but it's still basically the pro product. Just a couple tools are missing, more on the team level. And then they put out Visual Studio Code, which is like a more stripped down version of the IDE. Really, it's a whole separate product. Um, but all of a sudden, people are flocking back to using Microsoft tools for coding. And I will tell you, and this is opinion, by the way, right? I think like the preeminent IDE is Visual Studio by far. I mean, in terms of the power of IDEs, some of you I know were playing with like IntelliJ and the Java classes and still are. And that tool is probably one of the few that kind of gets close to Visual Studio, but it's still not Visual Studio, frankly. All right, so I'm going to leave this screen open and we'll come back here. But the next thing I want to do is I want to take us back to the core shell, and I'm going to move us over to the resources folder, which you're going to see in your left sidebar here, part of the way down. And in the resources folder, there are some pretty important things. So first of all, I do have a link to the Microsoft Azure Cloud. We're going there in a second. I will, once I know everybody has the textbook, we'll release the textbook PDF so you have a electronic copy that you can pull up here if you need. If you got, let's say you bought a physical one, right? That's possible. I do have all the code files for the book in the C# programming language that come from the publisher. And so when you see in chapter examples for stuff, all of those are in these zip files here. And this is really helpful to have around, by the way, and I'll show you as we kind of work through exercises and stuff why it's useful. Um, Because what happens in this book is basically this. We start stepping through the book, and the exercises, let's say in chapter 3, build into the exercises in 4, and then it kind of keeps going. And so if you got something screwed up in 4, you might need to fix it before you go to 5, right? And so those code files can help you do those fixes. But it's really just kind of nice to have all that stuff available. Another important thing that you'll have here, as with many of our other programming classes, we often ask you as students to turn in screenshots of what you're doing, right? And from an instructor standpoint, we usually ask for these in the Microsoft Word format, and this document here basically talks about how to get to Office 365. I would assume that all of you either have Office installed already, or are aware of the fact that you can go to your My Gateway account, just log in, and then like right up here in the quick link section, you can get to Office 365. Yes, this is the browser-based version. Hey, but you still have Word there, and you can still do, you're pasting your screenshots, type up your stuff, and turn in your work without installing any software, by the way. And kind of as a bizarre departure for me, I'm working on the school machine, and I've consciously, since I got this machine from the school, not installed Microsoft Office. It's the first time I've ever gotten a computer and not like immediately installed it, just to see kind of what life is like without it. So my personal machine has it installed, but I'm just trying this experiment, and I might end up finally installing it at some point. Um, but it's also kind of to prove to myself that I can do all the Microsoft Office stuff without having Microsoft Office. And one of the other options, of course, is just to use all the Google applications and create your Word docs that way as well. Up to you how you proceed, but I do want you to be aware. So if you guys are not taking advantage of this, heck, you should. You do have to set up a separate login, as you see, like I'm going through right now. But once you're in, you have access to all the key Microsoft applications, and yes, they're all browser-based, right, through this interface. But you also get this little button up here in the corner where you can choose to install Office. And the neat thing about the educational licensing on this is it does allow up to 5 discrete installs on 5 separate machines, which is pretty crazy when you start to think about like what Office costs, and they let you do that. The catch, of course, is it's tied to your gateway account. So when you graduate and your email account is retired, your sign-in kind of expires and you won't have access to this. So many of these tools, by the way, are also available for free directly from Microsoft if you have a Windows login of some sort. Once again, Xbox, Live Mail, Outlook, Office, blah, 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 Windows, etc. But if you want to install Office, here's the way you do it. Here's some of the applications. Now, what we need to do our work with, right? Some people are like, wow, do you get Visual Studio from Office 365? Well, sadly, absolutely not. All right, it's kind of on a different level of tool than what we see here, but I always like to point out to people that there are a lot of applications on this platform that a lot of students are not aware of. And I encourage you real strongly to, both install it if you want, or try some of these newer, weird Microsoft web-based tools. Some of them are really quite powerful and helpful, frankly. All right, jumping back now, back over to the course show. I do have this listing here for required software, which is reiterated in Unit 1, so we're going to review this in just a second. And I think that's all I have in here in terms of resources. But now I want to jump back to the Azure cloud. And some of you have been in this environment before. And what I'm going to do really quick here is I'm going to pause the video and ask a couple of questions of you guys. And I know some of you don't want to be recorded, which is fine. So here come the question. Now, some of you have used the Azure platform before and therefore probably already have a login. But the way that we have things set up is once you follow this link, you should be able, if not registered, to sign up with your Gateway student email account, and then it will auto recognize you as part of our domain and then allow you into the system. You will have to set up a separate password, and it'll be different from your Gateway passwords, by the way, and it is not controlled by one login either, so this is a separate login. So I'm going to follow this link here and go to the Azure cloud and pull it up on screen. And you can see that it's prompting me to sign in. So I'm going through the process, and apparently it recognizes, oh, great. I absolutely hate this. And you know, you guys know why I hate this is because I'm in the basement and I don't get my text messages often. So I'm gonna get my cell phone in there and wait for my phone to ring, hopefully. So I'm gonna pause the video here for the second. And for All right, once you clear the hurdle of getting logged in, you end up on the Azure platform. And depending on the type of account you have and how many times you've logged in before, you may actually end up on the home page of Microsoft Azure. And Microsoft Azure is kind of a unique thing to try to describe. So first of all, Azure is formally Microsoft's cloud computing platform. And what that means is that you can create computer environments within Azure to behave on any level that you wish. So without getting too deep into this, you can create server architectures with any operating system, file shares, databases, websites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can kind of see some of the things here, just, you know, icons here on some of the stuff that you can do. Yes, you can explore some of these, and you do get a trial period on some of these technologies, but I'm giving you fair warning. If you start to experiment with some of the Azure tools, once the trial period is over, the entry price for using the service starts at $250 a month for even the simplest of access. And so be really careful with what tools you play with. I have been working with some other people within the technical college system on figuring out ways that we can kind of get extended educational access to some of the services so we can teach them. That's part of a process. Where we want to be in this platform is in education. So if you don't see an icon that says education, just come up here to the top and type education, and that takes us to this area. And you remember when I was talking about the you know, the trial period and stuff? Here, this is what I'm talking about. Claim your Azure credit now. So they're giving you $100 in credit to like spin up a server or do whatever you want. But be careful what waters you walk there. I would, for the most part, stay away overall. What we're particularly interested in here is the software listing in the education area. And once you click on software, you bring up this like grand list of all this different stuff that you can download from Microsoft. And if you guys, you know, read through what I'm scrolling through here, you're noticing, first of all, that it's not like, you know, Microsoft Office, right? Or, you know, PowerPoint or something. It's like much heavier, deeper, more powerful type tools. So we got like operating system, server software, you know, data center tools, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this stuff is otherwise not available for free or maybe for trial, but usually those are expiring. All the licenses that you have for the products here are non-expiring. So I think that's really critical to know. So let's say I was interested, for example, in getting Visio, right, which is a tool that some of you might know about. I can come in here, just click on it, get the license key, and download it directly from here. And the license key that you get from here, well, as I said, is non-expiring. So what I always do whenever I grab a product from here, I make record of the license key for future usage, right? For any of the tools that I get here. So let's say like I install it on a machine and then I reconfigure it and I want to reinstall it. There's my license key, so I can do it legally. And when you start to look at what some of this stuff is, you're like, oh wow, this is probably really expensive. And yeah, some of it is super expensive, and we get it for free. The one thing that you'll notice is, and this, I didn't plan this, by the way, you'll see where my mouse ended up. It's like hovering over the Visual Studio Community 2019 edition. And I'm actually going to go ahead and click on that and bring it up. And then the first thing you're going to notice here is this one doesn't have a key or a button for the license or the product key because it's free, right? And so So if you download it from here, great. If you download it from the Microsoft website, great. Same thing, same difference. Don't need a license key, but you do need to log in with a Windows account. So that's the difference. If instead you would prefer to actually get the professional version of Visual Studio, here's how you find it here. Just come up here and just type Visual Studio, and the filter on the search engine will kind of narrow it down for us. Now you can see that we have the enterprise version, which is the full pro large enterprise type IDE. And what this has that is different than the community version are all the integrated team coding tools. So in other words, if you were working on a project team with like 100 developers, this has mechanisms built in where you can all share code and just do some higher level things, stuff that we're not really going to do here. So in my mind, why bother? And I think the community version is fine. And that, by the way, folks, that's what I'm going to install on my machine, is the community version. If you want to use one of the others, that's fine, but it should be enterprise or professional. And from what I'm seeing here, they don't even list professional on this thing. So they're saying either you're doing community or going to enterprise. Now, if I did choose enterprise, you will notice that this one does have a key. And so you can type that key in to the product when you're asked during the install process. So if that's going to be you, you would come in here, click that button, and then whatever key is going to come up in the window here, hit the little copy, paste it into a text document or something, and have it ready to go for that part of the licensing. Once again, if you do the community version, no worries, don't need it, right? But this is just a preemptive warning. If you're doing enterprise, here's your license. I'm going to get that off the screen there before people out on the internet start copying it. And I'll probably have to go back and obscure that in the video too. I should have thought about that in advance. But here's one place where you can download the tools. And remember, we do not want Visual Studio Code. That's the lightweight tool. Okay. All right. So just to make this easy, I'm going to pop out of Azure. I'm just going to close the tab, get the heck out of there. And I'm going to go back to Visual Studio, on Microsoft here. And I'm just going to download the community version directly from here. So here's what's going to happen. I am now going to begin the install steps for Visual Studio, and this is going to be embedded into this video. Part of the time as the install is happening, what's going to happen is, we'll get to a part where it's like transferring files or unzipping or whatever it's doing in the background, which is about as exciting as watching paint dry, and the video will be paused during some of those moments. But for those of you that are here in the session that are actively going through the install process, please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat or just speak up, unmute your mic and just speak up, and we'll address it directly. And some of the steps that we make during the install are best as if you wait and follow. However, the way that Visual Studio works, it has a separate install software package that it uses. You can always go back to that piece of software and add any components that you want, or remove ones that you didn't, by the way. And as we do the install, you guys might see some things that you do want to install that aren't required for this class, and I might do the same thing. So I might install like database tools. Well, we need those for this class, but I might install like data tools and Python tools and whatever languages I think I'm going to work with, and you should do the same. All right, so I'm going to really quick pause here for a question. All right, I'm going to go ahead and choose the community version here as I promised, and so let's start the download. And this has been a while since I've done this, so you can see the installer has already downloaded to my machine. I'm using Google Chrome, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the installer. And I just got a user control screen there, and I had to approve it to run. And so it's giving us a little message that says, before you get started, we need to set up a few things so you can configure your installation. Thank you, Microsoft. Let's follow that. So it's downloading a couple of files here, it seems. And it looks like what it's downloading is the installer itself. Now, the version that we are downloading, and I guess this is important to talk about it now, is going to be the 2019 version. Now, in general, my philosophy on like when you're downloading a software tool, right? If you're given a choice, why on earth would you download an old version, right? Typically you want to go with the newest one. But some of you that have been in the Java classes with me have seen, right? There's sometimes when certain things that you do, you have to go to old versions just because of the way the libraries are built. That's not really the case here. And in fact, with Microsoft, I'm very confident whenever they put out a new version, um, that there's still a way to get to doing the stuff I used to do within the new version without any loss of functionality. So I'm usually pretty brave about moving forward with them. Now, you know, as we're kind of selecting tools here, and some of you might already have started doing that. So like each one of these little boxes here are technologies that we can add to the installation. And as we select these tools, we just basically will do this. We're going to click the checkbox in the corner here to turn them on. So this becomes kind of fun in a sense because you can add things way beyond what we need for the class. However, right, and I'm trying to give you that warning, how much space is it going to take up? Okay, with none of the like add-on tools that we need selected, I want you to notice that the IDE itself, they have a little indicator here. It just says, basically under a gig, 859 megabytes. Um, that's not even a gigabyte of disk space. So Ty, what the heck are you talking about 100 gig? Well, we haven't added any of the tools yet, right? And those numbers will start to jump up. Now, what I've done in the core shell, if you guys want to use this for reference, and I'm going to, because I'll be real frank, I don't always remember just off the top of my head what I need and I don't need. So I make lists or I write it down or I take screenshots. And that's what I did here in this required software section. And so as you guys are looking at this entry in the course shelf, the first thing I'll tell you is every time I teach this class, I end up revising this entry based upon the actual experience of installing the IDE and what everybody's going through. And so like if you had advanced access to this and started proceeding and then would come back a couple days later and see that I changed it all because, hey, Microsoft changed it. That's why one of the reasons I don't pre-release this course. But one thing I will do is any of the instructions here that I feel have changed, I will adjust. But at the bottom of the posting, you guys will notice that there's this little box here that shows this is the stuff that I think in general you should have to do this class. And I will say that the very bottom listing, the one that's .NET Core cross-platform development, is actually not necessary. But the reason I included it in this screenshot is because, hey, I think this is kind of interesting because I could write something here and I could put it on a Mac and it would still work, or put it on a Linux machine, et cetera. And so I added it. But that one you could remove this little piece here. So the ones that we want are the core editor, that's included, the universal platform development for Windows, so we can write any Windows application, .NET desktop development, that's us, ASP.NET, that's us too, Azure development, because some of the tools that are in Azure allow us to connect to databases, the Node.js development environment, because yes, we may touch upon that in this course, and some of you are already maybe working with this technology in some of your other classes. So this is, and I'll tell you, I think Node.js is best inside of Visual Studio. That's my opinion, of course. Data storage and processing, so connecting to databases and working with data tools. And then some of the Office and SharePoint development tools as well. And I'm hoping this is kind of getting your wheels spinning as you're looking at the list. And it's like, wait, I can write applications for Office and SharePoint. That's cool. I can write stuff for the Azure cloud, et cetera. So it's like, oh, wow. Okay. We're just, and this is just scratching the surface. But we're going to use that list as kind of our guide. So now I'm going to go back to the Visual Studio installer and start selecting this stuff. And then you're going to notice what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple more, right? and you guys might choose to do the same thing, but keep your eye on this down here, and then keep in the back of your head what kind of disk space you have left. Because you might think it's cool to add the Python stuff, but then it's like, oh no, it's not going to fit. Well, okay, then don't, because we're not doing Python in this class, all right? And you probably already have Python tools anyhow. All right, so let's start choosing some of the tools. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab the ASP.NET and web development option. I also suggested, right, and that's all the way up to 9 gig already. We're going to throw in the Azure stuff, adds a couple more gig, not too bad. We're going to throw in Node.js. That barely even scratched anything here. I'm also going to throw in the Python tools, and I'm just watching. Didn't add much. Now, the why it didn't add much, well, all the Python libraries are already on my hard drive, right? So it doesn't have to download those. It just downloaded the tools it needs within Visual Studio to augment. Now, I hope you guys are also noticing in this installer, because it is such a powerful product, that you do have the capability within each of the products that you choose. You can just check the box and move on and not think about it. But then sometimes there's additional, stuff here that you could add. Now, I'm not going to add any of this stuff because I know from experience, right? Let's say, hey, if I need the Python web support, well, I know I can just bring up the installer, hit the button, do the install, and it'll be there, right? So you don't have to like go adding a whole bunch of stuff that you don't need. But at the same time, you might want to look at some of the options and go, hey, I might want that, that type of thing. And so I'll let you be your own judge. But if you just um, allow it to just run with the defaults, and you can see that one doesn't even have any options, it'll be fine, for this class. All right, so we got a few in there. Next, we're going to pull up the .NET desktop development. And basically what that allows us to do is predominantly code with one of these Windows languages, C#, Visual Basic, F#, etc., and allows us to create Windows desktop applications with some of these libraries, some of which are shared by ASP.NET, by the way. If you're into programming in C and C++, you might want to add this. This is one of the bigger libraries, though, because it's been around for, I just want to show you how big it is. This is at 12.45 gigs right now. I clicked that button. It didn't go up that much. But if, I was kind of expecting like it'd be like 20 gigs right there, but it wasn't. So that's something that you could add as well. I also recommend for most of you that you can add this Universal Windows Platform Development tool, because it adds some pretty interesting libraries. That one does add 10 gigs of storage right there. If you're curious about doing mobile development, you'll notice that they have the mobile development platform, and then you'll notice I do not have that selected here. But I'm going to give you a heads up, right? Some of you might be also signing up for the mobile development class. And if you're not doing it this semester, maybe you're doing it next or the one after that, where you will be adding in these libraries for the mobile development class, by the way. Okay. And that's if you're doing it with .NET, separate libraries for C++. Some of you may also have been possibly working on some of the gaming certificate classes that we have here, and in which case your instructor will probably guide you to install the Unity engine. And so if you were doing game development, the tools are here, folks, and those are two fairly large libraries. I am avoiding them currently. I am going to go ahead and choose the data storage and processing. And this is important for all of us because when we get to the database chapters in this book, we will need these tools. But I do want you to notice that not only SQL Server, so this gives us the ability to like kind of interface with SQL Server natively right within the environment. We can even write SQL Server queries right from within Visual Studio Code. And in fact, what a lot of people don't know is the management studio for SQL Server really is Visual Studio. And so, yes, so you can do all your SQL Server stuff right from this product. For me, because I do teach in the data analytics program, I'm also adding all the data tools here. That's my personal preference, and the Office and SharePoint development tools, which I think are helpful as well. I'm going to say that you probably can skip this one if you want, and I'm just kind of being kind of like on the fence with it, I would recommend that you install it rather than not. And then if you're interested in doing cross-platform work, and this is one I always mean to like delve into this and learn more about it, but I haven't really seemed to in the last few years. But this is the library that would work on the Mac, and this is actually one of the only libraries available on the Mac. So it shows you how much more limited the Mac version is. But this area is growing quickly, and Microsoft definitely has plans to kind of make this the core of the whole platform ultimately, which is why they call it .NET Core, by the way. But it is cross-platform. So if you're curious, you can grab that one too. Right now, I'm at 25.29 gigabytes. How much would it add if I did this? Oh my gosh, like nothing. I'm going to go ahead and add it. Right, not a big deal. I'm leaving all the C++ off, I'm leaving the mobile stuff off for now, but grabbing just about everything um, else. There's other tabs up at the top here, but we really don't really need these at the moment. But you know what? Let's at least take a look. So let's look at individual components. So here's where you can choose what libraries you're using, what frameworks you're using, the version numbers, all the little things that you do with various IDEs. And if you start to do a comparison, like for us being in the Java classes, and all of you have been in Java classes with me, which is helpful, obviously. And think of like the troubles that we go through to like get like the JDKs and the SDKs and JREs and all that stuff. And like where do you find them and where do you download them from and why do I need this one? Where do I find that one? And then you come to Visual Studio and it's like, well, which ones do you want? Oh, you can have all of them. It's such a different approach. And one of the reasons I really like this IDE, because it is like that. You can choose the individual modules and libraries. So all of the stuff that was coming down here as extensions of each one of these are conglomerated in this list, and you can pick them one by one. In some cases, you might be working with foreign languages, so if that's you, and I do get students like that, so hey, go for it, right? The coding is all in English, though, by the way, regardless of what language pack you load. But it does, like if you speak, I don't know, Polish, you can get your menus in Polish and your IntelliSense in Polish. And then you can also choose where you're installing it to. So you don't have, like, for example, I have a D drive, right? And in some cases, when my C drive fills up, sometimes I put programs on the D drive. Sorry about that. But so for those of you that are that particular about where you install things, and one clever trick I learned from someone a really long time ago, like if you do have like alternate drives in your machine, so let's say you have a D drive, instead of this going like D/software/Visual Studio, creating your own folder, what I saw somebody do once is just change the drive letter at the front, like that. And I'm like, oh, that's really clever, because then it uses the same folder architecture on the D drive that it does on the C drive. Makes it really easy to find. I am going to leave it on the C drive on my machine because that is my SSD and I want it to run fast. So that's where I'm putting it. It's not really taking up that much room. I think it's also interesting that they kind of break it down and tell you where they're putting the different components, right? So not everything ends up in the same folders. And those different resources consume different amounts of space, and you can kind of control that. So like, for those of you struggling with disk space, this is why I bring this up. And I really don't know if the older versions of Visual Studio gave you this kind of granular control, but I was very pleasantly surprised when at least the last 2, 3 versions, like 2015 on up, came out, and they gave you this control. It really makes it a lot easier. All right, next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go back to that first tab, the workloads tab, and then I'm going to point out here that there's this box that says install while downloading. And so to explain the difference here, I think it's pretty intuitive, but the one thing that you can do is you can choose the second option, which is to download everything. So it pulls all the files down and then does the install after it's all downloaded. So you wait for the download and then wait for the install. And that was the old-fashioned way of doing it. When we would do like full install, so if I selected like every option, for example, the download was about an hour, even on a high-speed connection, and then the install was like an hour. So you would be sitting there for 2 hours, doing this. And not fun and very time consuming. I really like that they did this because basically what they've done is, this stuff comes down in batches, right? So like you're installing one tool and then another tool and then another tool. Well, I can download one and start installing it. And then while that one's installing, I can download the next one. And that's kind of the scheme they use here. And it significantly improves the install time. And so here's my experiment, folks. So it is 7:52. I'm going to go ahead and start the install with that time in mind. Let's see how long it takes. And, specs on the machine. So if you want to do this, if you're a techno geek, it's okay. Ty, what kind of machine are you running? Let's see. We got 16 gigs of RAM, 9th gen i7 at 2.6 gigahertz. No slouch. So it's pretty fast, and I'm on a pretty fast connection. So let's see how long that takes. All right, so I'm going to hit the install button. Now, this screen will come up, and this will stay active here, and it will. Okay, some of your selections are no longer fully supported and will not receive security updates. Okay, fine, whatever. Not really too worried about it too much, especially since all my Python stuff's pretty well in order with other IDEs. Now this is showing me my transfer rate. So right now I'm 12 megabytes, when it's capital, that's what that indicates per second. So I'm at about 120 megabits roughly, a little less than that, which is about right for our network when other people are using it here at home. And you see I'm at 5% already. So this is going to go pretty darn quick, it seems. So I'm just letting it do its thing. While it's doing its thing, I do want to bop us back over to the Azure cloud, and I want to talk about Windows 10 education. This is really a good time to talk about it since we're waiting for the installer to complete. And you guys notice that I brought up a file window, and then I right-clicked on this PC and I chose Properties, which gives me my system information, kind of like the core information of my system. And you'll notice here with the Windows version that I am on Windows 10 Education. And I had made a recommendation earlier that, as an aspiring IT pro, you really shouldn't be using Windows Home anymore. You really should be using the more powerful versions of the operating system, either professional or education. You can get a key for the education version from the Azure cloud. So I'm going to take myself back to the Azure cloud. Hopefully it doesn't do the text message thing again. Boy, that will be a pain. Amusing to watch me run upstairs to get the text message, but not fun for me to do it. Hopefully it remembers that I was signed in like 5 minutes ago. All right, thankfully it did. And I'm going to go back to the software area here, and then I'm going to type Windows, I do it correctly, the Windows 10. And then you'll notice it brings up a bunch of different versions of Windows 10. And in fact, many, many different ones. And it's kind of confusing, I'll be real frank, when you're looking at this, like, well, they give you Windows 10 for free. I don't know what to grab. And the truth is they're really only giving you two choices. That's, and some of them are basically locked in time. So if you look at the two different versions that they have out here, so they have one which was the November update in 2020, so they're coding it. See, and that's the 20H2 build, and then the 21H1 build, which is the more recent one. And my recommendation is, if you get the older version, it's just gonna upgrade you to the newer version anyhow, so why even bother, right? So just go to the new version directly. And if you want to upgrade to Windows 10 Education, you just come here, click the View Key button, and it'll bring up your product key in a little box here. Copy that key, and then all you have to do to activate it is come back to the System Information screen, click this link right here, Change Product Key. You follow the screens, you'll get a screen where you drop in that product key. My experience is it takes somewhere between like 10 to 20 minutes, something like that. And that will basically unlock all the higher end features of Windows, which are already on your hard drive, by the way. They're not like downloading it or anything. They're pulling it right from your machine. They're just saying, hey, now you can use them. And you'll be upgraded to a new version of Windows. The education version, as I mentioned before, is equivalent to the professional version, and real close to the enterprise version. And some people have told me that the education version actually has more features than either one of those, and I haven't experienced that. But what's available in the pro and enterprise versions that aren't in the home version? One real important tool is a tool called Remote Desktop, where you can remote control different versions of Windows or machines running Windows from afar. That's a really powerful tool. It also gives you file encryption, higher level networking tools, and a bunch of other stuff I don't remember. But those are like the key ones. And some of those are pretty important, especially for higher level IT work. The other thing is the virtualization tools that are built into the higher levels of Windows are now available. So you can do things like run Hyper-V. And Hyper-V is Microsoft's version of like VirtualBox or VMware, where you can run other operating systems inside a container inside of Windows. And that's part of the tools that come with it too. And you know what? As students, you guys get access to this for free, where if you were to go out and buy a copy of Windows Professional, what would it cost? I assure you it's hundreds of dollars, if not even more. And hey, take advantage of it. It's a non-expiring key. Why not, right? That's kind of my thinking. So even if maybe you don't use it on the machine that you're working on right now, you can use it on a different one. Or maybe you'll build a PC in the future and there's your license key for Windows. So that's a really important tip, because that's a big money saver as well. I'm going to go back to the installer and see where I'm at, and I can kind of see the progress bar here. It's doing pretty good. We started at 7:52, 7 minutes in. It looks like the download's at 67% and the install's at 43. So here's what I'm going to suggest to us collectively here as we kind of watch paint dry. We're at 7:59. It's 8 o'clock. I'm going to suggest that we take like a 5-minute break or so, and because in 7 minutes it got about halfway there, and so maybe in 5 minutes we'll be almost done, and we can resume the video and see where we're at. So, and then we're going to start digging into the product. All right, so let's do another 5-minute break. It's 8 o'clock. We'll come back at like 8:05 or so, and I will see you all then. The video will be paused, and I'll see you guys all in a few minutes. Folks, I was just jumping back on here after a short break here, and it looks like we were able to do this full install in 15 minutes flat, which is pretty impressive. I will attribute part of the speed. I am using a new computer with ample disk space, and I'll say fairly cutting edge technology and a pretty fast internet connection. Your experience might be a little bit slower than that, but I am hyper impressed. Compared to the old days, I remember my very first install of Visual Studio. I mean, it was literally hours. And so the fact that we can do it this quick now is a great thing. Now, I'm going to pause the video here real quick and just kind of pose a few questions to the students, and I will be right back. All right, I was making sure that all of my people here are okay with their tools and their installs, and we kind of have like a mixed boat of people in various states. So some people had it already, but not all the tools, and other people didn't. And I think generally speaking, I think maybe my bandwidth's a little faster than most, so I got done really in a much shorter period of time. And if I could kind of piggyback off that thought for a second, why does it make sense to maybe pay 15, 20, 30, 50 bucks a month more for faster internet? Because if that's like work time for you, right? If it takes you like an hour to install a piece of software as opposed to 15 minutes, well, you just lost 45 minutes of time. What's your billable rate? Yeah, and you know what? And somebody just posted in the chat here that once they get past a certain point, their internet gets throttled, and that happens too. So just keep that all in mind as you're doing that. And if you're downloading this on like a cellular data plan, generally I'm going to say don't. Go to your local coffee shop and do it or something, because you can burn through your whole data plan pretty fast, and that can get pricey. But the time saved in productivity, though, is a huge factor in IT. So people in IT think about that because it's like, hey, if I'm waiting to do something and I'm getting paid, let's say $100 an hour or something, that's really valuable time, right? And how much money do you want to waste, So you can take that $50 and put it into that extra internet cost, and there you go, and you gained some time back in your day on top of it all. The thing that I'm going to point out about this installer, and it's kind of hard to tell with the screens that I have up, that this is actually a separate product. But if you look in your start menu, and I don't know if it'll find itself here, there it is, Visual Studio Installer. If you ever need to add, remove, or augment your installation, you can always come directly to this piece of software here and add the pieces that are missing. So let's say that later on you decide, hey, I want the mobile tools or whatever. You can come back in there and choose them. And now in the old days, the installer component was actually integrated right into Visual Studio, and now they have it as a separate piece of software. And I think it makes a lot more sense. I was not comfortable with it at first, but that's how IT is. You get comfortable with your old ways, and they're like, why the hell do they do it this way? And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I get it. This makes sense to do it that way. And now that I've experienced it for a while, I really like it. The other piece I'll tell you guys that I think is pretty interesting is Visual Studio 2019. The year is now 2021, right? But this is the last major release that they've put out, 2019. Um, and fortunately, as I was creating the videos for this course a couple summers ago, boy, it's a blur. I think it was 2 years ago. I was bold. Visual Studio 2019 had just come out, and I was like, you know what? I'm going for it. Um, and I did, and I was glad that I did at the time. But don't be afraid to do that. This IDE in particular is pretty forgiving that way. Not all of them are, though. You should take that to heart, though, too. All right. Now that we have this installed, let's go ahead and launch the product and see what it looks like. I'm being bold here because I am loading it on a machine where it's clean and it doesn't have any of these tools on it.
And
And
not
right
sharing your screen.
Oh, Tom, thank you so much. Keep me from making a fool of myself here. So here I am with the installer screen. Thank you for saying that, Tom. I appreciate it. And as I hit on the installer screen, I hit the launch button. You'll notice that it's not asking for product key because it's free, but it is asking you to sign in. Now you can skip it and it's go not now, maybe later, but if you make that option, it's going to start nagging you all the time to do it. So if you do have a Microsoft account, sign in. Okay, so here's the really cool thing. If you just signed into Azure and Microsoft Office as part of the demonstrations I was doing, that's the account you want to use. It's better to use your gateway account, in my opinion, to connect to it. Now, some people will be reluctant for they're like, well, what happens when I'm done a gateway? Will this account expire? Well, it is a separate account, so technically no. But if you do have a personal Microsoft account of some type, the Windows account, Xbox, etc., you can use that too. They just want you to sign in because what that does is it attributes the fact that you're, a qualified Windows user and you're a real person and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and do a sign in here. And let's see how automatic it is. So hopefully it recognizes me from my other Office products or whatever. So it found me. That's great. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. I don't know if it'll ask for a password because I don't remember what it is, but we'll figure it out, right? And you can see it's giving me this like preparing for first use screen. And we'll just sit here and watch. Pretty exciting. All right. So now we're actually into the product, believe it or not. And just to kind of make it clear that we are, I'm getting rid of the non-Visual Studio screens. And really what we're looking at here now is the splash screen that you get when opening Visual Studio. If you were used to an older version of Visual Studio, you would actually land in the product. So the IDE would all come up, and then you would just get a screen kind of like this as a tab inside the environment where you can do some of the common things. So for example, open a project that you're working on, open a folder, create a new project. and then get into the product. And we will navigate these screens. In fact, there'll be certain types of selections that we'll make very routinely, and you'll get to know the screens one by one. And I will explain them to you in detail as we proceed. But for right now, I'm not really interested in creating your project. I just want to see Visual Studio up on my screen. And so I'm going to click on Continue Without Code, right? So it's just going to open the product. And well, here it is, folks. Nothing too exciting to look at least initially. But I assure you that this is a super powerful environment. So let's kind of get to know it a little bit before we go too deep into like coding or anything like that. The first thing you notice is that it follows, kind of a traditional Microsoft look and feel, for their application. It's not like Microsoft Office though, so we don't have like the ribbon bar like we have in Word, where they have this exaggerated toolbar that's high and it's got all this stuff in it. This instead has a large collection of toolbars that are context sensitive. So in other words, if I'm working on a database, this toolbar will change and other tools will come up. If I'm working on, HTML, different tools will come up. And then some of them, for example, like our toolbox sometimes gets embedded on the side here. So you can see this little toolbox button and you can see I'm bringing it up and it's initializing right now. So it's never launched before. So it's kind of building the tool set. And of course it's empty because I don't have a project. So it doesn't know what kind of tools to pull up. But the toolbox also will pull up tools that are relative to the kind of project that you're working on. So if you're working like on an HTML page, it'll give you the option to like pull in an image or a button or a text field or something like that. And that sometimes gets embedded into the side like that. Like most IDEs, Visual Studio does have the ability to significantly customize the interface you're working in. And so you can arrange your windows a certain way, move stuff to other screens, etc., and then save that workspace as a thing that you can recall and go right back to that mode. Now, I think it's particularly cool if you're a multi-screener and you start taking some of these auxiliary tools like the toolbox and Solution Explorer and you put them on your other screen and then all your code is right here, or your output screen and your code are right here, however you choose to work. But that's what some of the interface is. You will notice that many of these tools will have these little push pins, right? And so you can click the push pin and the toolbar just stays there, right? And on top of that, you can also grab the toolbox and start moving it. And as you start moving it, you get this like weird icon here in the middle. And depending on which one of these icons I hover over, it will show you where it would place the whole tool. Right, and really none of those are what I want. I actually want to go back to the default here. That's fine. And actually, I'm going to unpin it. I don't always like my toolbox there. One of the more important interfaces inside of Visual Studio, frankly, is what we call the Solution Explorer. Now, those of you that are currently in my Java class, and where we're using like Eclipse, for example, you'll relate this tool real closely to, I think, what they call the Package Explorer or Project Explorer. I forget what they call it even. Every tool calls it something else, right? But the whole point is the assets for the project will be listed here. Now that could be in the form of files and folders, or it could be in the form of objects. And you'll see as we kind of proceed, there's a whole lot that you can do from that interface, and you will be using it a lot. And then you also have some other tools. So they have the ability here, for example, you can connect this up to your GitHub account if you have one, if you want to use that as your place to store your files. You can also look at the servers that you're connecting to. So if you have like file servers or data servers or database servers, you can explore those assets directly from here. As you develop code, you will have a coding window and then console areas where you can either see the console or the output boxes, for debugging mistakes, etc. So, and that's kind of the general feel of the product. The one thing that I've noticed that's been added to the menu since the last time I've used this is they have a whole menu for all the GitHub stuff now because uh, whether you guys are aware of this or not, Microsoft purchased GitHub, and if you're not aware, GitHub is basically this large code repository that people use, mostly because it's free. The other thing I warn people about though is whenever you put stuff on GitHub, it's also public, right? Unless you do the paid version. So anything you put out there can be seen by others by just searching. And so I'm not always personally comfortable doing that, but if you are, and I know some of you already have GitHub accounts, you can connect it up and you can use GitHub as your save location. So wherever you would save your code would go to GitHub. And they have a whole uh, menu included now for that, which is new. Those are pretty significant things. All right, I'm going to pause here once again, and I'm just going to open it up for questions. So if there's a real pertinent one, I'll record it into the video. All right, so I made sure everybody was okay or figured out what their status was, and it seems like we all have either are successful or have a battle plan to be successful or are in progress, right? And right now I'm going to actually divert our attention over to the book to let the book help guide us through the next portions of the class here. And I'm going to bring up on screen here, I think I had it loaded up in my browser, so I'm just trying to find it. Let's see if it's here. It sure is. And I do have us in chapter 1 of our book. And my goal here is to step us through this chapter. So we are dealing with a book that is somewhat dated, and I'm fully aware of it and all the quirks that go with it. And my goal here is to kind of guide you through how the book is structured, well, the materials that they're presenting here as well, and what is significantly different from what's printed in this first chapter and what we're about to do, because there have been significant changes in the Microsoft ecosystem in particular. All right, so let's just kind of like plow through the material. So the general point is to install Visual Studio. Well, guess what? We've already done that. So that's actually a big thing off our plate. And it's better to follow, I think, my guide than it is to follow what's here. And then we're going to go through the process of actually creating our first web application using some of like the built-in and frankly fairly automatic website building tools. And then you guys will all go, well, why don't we learn how to do websites like this right away? Right? Well, it's because you got to learn the technology first. That's one of the answers. And then we'll talk about how ASP.NET really works, and then the IDE itself and some of the things that you can do, which we've already talked about. So that should go pretty fast. There is a whole history really to this whole .NET thing, though, and I'm sure you guys have kind of sort of figured that out by now. But when we started out with server-side programming languages in IT, what happened is Microsoft was not a leader in it. It's not impolite to say that. They were kind of a follower, right? So like other people came up with the idea of the web browser, for example, and then Microsoft built one. And other people came up with the idea of like HTML, and Microsoft's like, okay, well that'll work in our browser too. Great. Other people came up with the idea of JavaScript, so Microsoft came up with its own version, of course, which they called JScript, and it was for a while it was two separate languages. They have now merged, by the way. And then Microsoft watched like brand new technologies, like back in the 90s, like PHP, which rolled around, and most of you have either taken the PHP class by now or are taking it right now. And with PHP, you realize that you're creating this code that only runs on the web server and can do things with the web server because it's on the web server, like talk to a database or create files or run programs or whatever, and then serve back pages that are much more powerful than just a static HTML page. We then have truly dynamic websites. Now, what's fascinating is Microsoft watched the PHP crowd kind of rise to prominence, and they're like, well, we can do that too, right? As they did. And they came up with a technology called ASP. And what they refer to here is active server pages and classic ASP. And so that was its very own scripting language that, just like PHP, operated as an embedded HTML language. So in other words, you would write your HTML document, you would throw in some script tags or delimiters or whatever, and then you would drop in your classic ASP code, and you would intermingle it with your HTML. The server would read it and then do whatever, and then send back to the browser HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just like PHP does. You know, if the user pulls up the web page, does a right-click view source, they can't tell what created that web page. They see the after effect of it, not the code that created it. And so that was actually a fairly popular technology. So there were lots of websites that were created using ASP code. And I'm not sure if this is still the case, but last time I think I looked at it, I was like poking around on W3 schools, and I thought this is kind of interesting because they, W3, they teach all like the major, you know, uh, web technologies. HTML, of course, is like the most popular one. But when you dig into their technologies here, as you kind of go through like, oh, all this cool like modern stuff, and there's, ooh, hey, ASP, right? And and so if you are curious about the ASP language, and the one that we're talking about, by the way, is ASP. All right, so the classic original. Um, but we will be learning these other other things, the newer, more modern technologies. So yes, this stuff is still available on W3 schools, and they give you great tutorials. But the classic ASP looks like this, and I'm just trying to get you to like where you see an example. So like you have this approach of your HTML, and then remember with PHP you do like question mark PHP. Well, here you would put in a percent sign, and then you write your classic ASP code. And it's not hard to figure out what this does. It says, response write. Well, that's like a write line or a print or whatever, and it's putting that up on the screen, and it carries on with being a web page. Now, that is a little tiny bit of what we're going to learn here. That's not our focus at all. We introduce it, we play with it a little bit. Hey, if you want to really dig into it, it's all out on the web. You can figure it out. But this is not what people are using anymore. In fact, they evolved ASP.NET to be like, well, why would we have an interpreted language where we can compile the language, which is what .NET is. But this was Microsoft's basic equivalent to the whole PHP thing, right? Embedded in the HTML, had to run server side. The output code ultimately ends up being HTML, and this creates that. Not very exciting, but that's what it is. All right, and then as we kind of stepped into the future, they started to realize that if we could take some of that code and then utilize the binaries that are built into the Windows runtime libraries. And so when we compile Windows applications, in order for a program to be able to run inside of Windows, it has to get converted either to run on a virtual machine like it does with Java, or it has to compile through the common runtime libraries that Microsoft has that can take code from probably about 20 or 30 different languages conservatively. I'm speculating here on the actual number. So it could be C#, C++, Python, whatever. And it turns it into a binary, an exe file that executes on the server. So it's not running the code on the fly. This is what I was mentioning before we started the videos tonight. But it turns it into a binary, which will operate faster on the server. So when you trigger something running on the server, you're actually running something that's precompiled. It's not interpreted on the fly. And that brought significant performance gains. So like one problem that people have is that we're doing all the server side stuff, but man, that thing is slow, and so how do we improve it? And they came up with .NET 1, version 1, and they allowed us to code over this. They talk about this whole different development stream that happened, but Visual Studio came to be as the .NET runtime or the shared runtime libraries were all kind of put together, and then Visual Studio was the tool that allowed it to happen. So here's a really important thing to think about. Whenever you're working with an operating system, every major platform, and we look at the big three, so Windows, the Mac OS, and Linux, um, also come with a development language that was used to create the actual operating system, right? Um, and Windows is no exception. So Windows, well, we should backtrack and say, well, DOS came before Windows. DOS was built using BASIC. When they switched to Windows, originally it was still built with BASIC, honestly. But then they got to where Windows became truly a visual programming language, like you'll see here in Visual Studio. And at that point, the tool set became different. And so what happened is we started seeing languages like Visual Basic and tools that went with it that allowed you to pre-create the GUI aspects of your applications with simple drags and drops. It's like, yeah, I want a window, I want a button, I want some images, I want a scroll bar or whatever. You just like drag and drop them in, adjust their properties, write a little bit of code, and boom, you got an application, right? And that was Visual Basic that allowed that, and that was the the coding language that was used to create the first GUI versions of Windows, like truly GUI, and I mean Windows 95, 98, XP, etc. And that continued. And Visual Basic was still the primary development language for Windows up until recently. And it was not maybe like 10 years or so ago that they started transitioning over to this new language that we're going to learn about in this class too, called C#. And that comes up on the next page here. But we are allowed, if we want, and this book is written to accommodate both of these languages, so they give all the examples in both Visual Basic and C#. And you'll see that the two languages are somewhat similar, but they are uniquely profound, separated programming languages in syntax and technique. C# is a C-style language like Java, which has curly brackets and semicolons. Visual Basic is not. It's a little bit more like Python, where one statement's on one line. There's no terminating character. You don't need curly braces or semicolons. And the nice thing about our book is that it shows both. Our focus in this class, and you guys should be strongly aware of this, is what's matched by the move that Microsoft has made, where Microsoft still supports Visual Basic, but it's not a language of growth or development per se. C# has become the preferred language for coding on just about every Microsoft platform. It is a variant of the C or C++ development stream, so it has a lot of similar syntax, but is very Microsoft-esque, and many of the techniques that you would use in Visual Basic apply directly to C#. When we get a few chapters in, we will look at programming in C#. We don't get like super deep into it, because the assumption at this point is, folks, that you guys are so sharp now with your languages. Is like, oh, this is kind of like Java, or this is kind of like Python, or whatever. You can just look at it, kind of figure it out. If you can't figure it out, you look it up. You Stack Overflow it or whatever, and you figure out the stuff you need to do, the tasks you need to do. And as you work professionally, you get to know the tools better and better. So, scratching the surface on C#. If you were in the software developer program, and I don't know if any of you guys are doing that, they really dig much deeper into C# because that's their intro programming language, and then you 3 levels of it basically, so you get pretty deep into it. But if you know any of the C-style languages, Java is probably the most pertinent one. It's really not that dissimilar. The concepts are the same, syntax is different, but it's curly brackets and semicolons and classes and objects and methods and all those things that we're used to. What's really cool about working with that whole .NET platform, though, basically, is the fact that because we're working with the runtime libraries that help run Windows, and we all compile all our languages through that, we can actually create operating system native in principle, applications that run directly on the operating system without an emulator needed. Now, a secondary thought on that, one of the modern ways of protecting an operating system now is to actually run applications on top of emulators, and Windows does that now too with some of their deployment techniques. But you do have the capability with Visual Studio to deploy operating system native executables, and that's important to know. Because those types of executables are significantly faster on an operating system than virtual. There was a whole development stream for this, and as they would up the versions of .NET, ASP kind of followed. And what they started doing is they started taking the ability of the scripting part of ASP, adding program code to the back end of the ASP files, and kind of merging the two platforms. So you're doing like this web stuff, so it's intermingled with HTML, and then behind that web page, you have C# code, which gets compiled and attached to the file. It's a kind of a bizarre architecture. And with every version, major version upgrade of the technology underneath, they would also come out with different versions of .NET. So when you see different version numbers, .NET, and then different versions of Visual Studio that match up typically with the .NET versions. All of the versions of Visual Studio are backwards compatible, so you can take older things and kind of move backwards with them, with some cautions in some cases, because some things do get outdated. Now, they start pushing in this book the fact that there's a version of Visual Studio called Visual Studio Express, and I guess I maybe shouldn't have scrolled off of that too quick, which is what they suggest that you install, because back when they printed this book, that was the free version, Visual Studio Express. You didn't even need a license for it or anything. You just go to the Microsoft website, and basically what you would get is a lightweight version of Visual Studio that could only code with Visual Basic and C#, those two programming languages, and then the web technologies. It had no other tools attached to it. And that was always the recommendation for students back then. Not a philosophy we had here at Gateway. Our philosophy is let's get to the pro tools, because that's what you're going to use on the job, and that's why we're here to train you to be on the job, not to use the lightweight tools. They talk about where you can get the product. We're not worried about that. We already have it, right? So don't install any of the stuff that is listed here. But when they finally got to this version of the textbook, so when they did .NET 4.5.1, that matched up to the Windows 8.1 operating system, Windows Server 2012 R2, and then Visual Studio 2013 matched up with those operating systems. And when they printed this book, that was the version of Visual Studio that they had, and they go through the whole process here of telling you how to download and install it. And you'll notice, the significant improvement in the install interfaces, including what stuff you're installing, etc. So not worried about that. You guys will use as the reference what's listed in Unit 1 with this little list here. That's what you want in your Visual Studio, which we already talked about. All right, now we're moving to the actual exercise part of the class, and this is where we kind of get into the tutorial aspect of the class, because this is going to basically be your assignments for this class. So if you want like the preview of what this class is, anything that says try it out, that's your homework basically. And for as lame as that seems, these are really valuable exercises. However, with the caveat that these are designed for that version of Visual Studio, your screens may and absolutely in some cases will look completely different. And here's where the expertise of like me going through it many times before helps in these videos for doing the work. They get pretty wordy here. What I will do is I will look at these general steps, complete the task, and then kind of move forward to kind of demonstrate the technology. But the point here is that we're going to bring up the product on the screen. Should already be running, lines running in the background. And then we will make the selections that they're trying to push us to, and get it running. You know, so the first try it out exercise really is kind of building a basic ASP.NET website using the automatic built-in tools, um, which we will sometimes use and sometimes not. Um, but it is kind of an aha thing when you see it happen the first time, and really gets your brain thinking really fast. It's like, oh, that was really easy and it looks really good. I could really use this, right? You know, as a pro. And you'll notice as we make this first, sample website, wow, this looks like a lot of other people's websites. Yeah, because they all use the same tool, folks. They all use the same template to start their website. So yeah, they look the same. All right, so the first thing is to start the product, and it just gives us a couple different things. And so it goes through the whole thing about signing in and all that stuff. We've already launched it. We've already signed in. So step one is fine. Okay. Um, it says if you're using a commercial version, you may also get different collections of settings and blah, 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 blah. We took care of all that. And is done as well. Now they're saying once it's fully configured, you see a main screen appear just like in figure 1.3. Let's take a look. And here is the difference between the startup interfaces between the product. So in the old version, we'd start the product and that splash or whatever you're going to do next screen is right there as a start page. And a lot of IDEs do this. And then usually you're like, you either find your project on a list here, right, the one you were working on, open one, or then you choose a new one and then you make a bunch of selections. So that's basically where we're going to go. And we're going to try to get through these boxes, but you're going to see they look significantly different. In fact, the first time I encountered it, I'm like, oh my God, what choices should I make? This is thanks Microsoft, you changed it all on me, and I had this stuff all down. But this is what happens, right? You guys got to flow with this stuff, and not freak out to it. And that's why I'm here, is to help guide you. All right, so we are going to go ahead and we are going to create a new project. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio now, and this is the installer. So I do not need the installer on screen, by the way, anymore. I'm just going to close that. And this other tab here is Visual Studio, and I am signed in. And you can tell you're signed in, by the way, by the little icon up there, by the way. Okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to come up to the file menu here and choose new. And what you're going to notice is it's going to bring, I'm trying to get the menu to just cooperate with me here. It's going to bring back that same template screen, basically. Now, so for some of you, this might be a little bit different, but basically what we're doing is we're going to create a new project and we're going to choose a selection of settings. And in the old days, if you look at the book, what they used to do is basically have like these expanding lists, and you're like, well, I'm going to be in Visual Basic. I'm going to create an ASP empty website. This is my framework. This is where I'm saving it. Okay, done, right? And you just click the button and go. Their approach is a little different now. So their thinking is this. It's like, what operating system are you coding for? What platform are you outputting to? What languages are you using? And they ask that here as a series of drop-down boxes. All right. And I just kind of wanted to show you. So here's the languages that are currently supported by the IDE. So you can see how many are right out of the box are supported. And notice how they have, query language, which is SQL technically. But C#, C++, F#, JavaScript, Python, query language, TypeScript, Visual Basic, and XAML, straight out of the box. You can choose any one of those languages. Most of the work that we're going to do here is typically going to be, you're going to think of it as HTML based, but it's really ASP.NET, which means you have to choose a programming language, which means C# for us. All right. Next, what platform are we outputting to? Okay, so now this is where it can be a little bit different because, all right, well, I'm not coding for a phone, so it's not Android or Azure or iOS or Linux or Mac OS, blah, 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 blah. And most likely you're going to say Windows. Although you can leave that blank, by the way, and say all platforms, because the other option here becomes, well, what are you outputting to? The cloud, console, the desktop? Are you creating extensions, games, blah, 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 blah? Or web, right? Which is, it sounds like us. Now, and this is where I get a lot of people fall in this little trap because Microsoft is actively pushing their new .NET Core platform very heavily. They want the world to switch to that because that's the cross-platform area. So wherever you say ASP.NET Core, we don't want that right now, right? If you were on a Mac, that would be kind of like your only choice. So what we're going to do is we're going to find ASP.NET web application with a .NET framework. That's the particular template that we're looking for. And I want you to look at the little icons they put down here. So we're working with C#, that's the programming language in the background. Yes, we're working on a Windows platform, which means it's got to be on a Windows server to execute, or PC. And then we can push it out to the cloud or the web. Hey, that's us. Okay, so this is what we want, is ASP.NET web application with a .NET framework. It is not the one at the top, so please be really mindful of that. And if you're curious before you make the final, move on to the next screen, you can kind of look through all the different choices too. And I think that's not a bad thing to do. And yes, there's other frameworks and project templates that you can download for free from Microsoft. They have a gazillion of them, but we're going to stick with the basic ones here for now. All right, so I have ASP.NET web application, .NET framework, and I'm hitting next. All right, so now we get this screen. And when you compare to the book, this screen, I don't know if they show this one, it's basically where we are here. So you chose the project and whatever, and I don't know if you're naming it here. Maybe that's on the next screen. And apparently, all right, they're not showing that screen, but we are going to name our application, and you can name it, heck, whatever you want. My really, really strong suggestion here is that you name it, kind of what it is, right? And so I'm going to say chapter 1, and maybe hello world or something like that. I just want to be very clear as to what file it is. Now we come to the second box here. And normally I would say, okay, just next, agree, whatever, and you move on to the next screen. Here's where I want you guys to be really, really careful. I want you to notice that it chose for me a save location. This is not a save location that is commonly accessible through like my file interface. In fact, you want to look at this really carefully. See users, my username, and then a source folder. I've never seen that before, and a repos folder, right? Or repository is what that stands for. And so what they're doing, if you want to kind of analyze it, is they're taking you to the C drive, to the user folder, to your account, and then they put a folder here where your code's going to go. Okay, that can work for some of us, right? I'll be real frank. I'm not really comfortable with that when I write code, because one thing that happens is, what if I want to go to a different machine and pick up and continue my work? All right, well, some people say that's where GitHub comes in. So for some of you, you can connect up your GitHub account and store your stuff to GitHub. Okay. That aside, let's talk on a more practical local file level. What I used to do in the old days is I would save my stuff to my Google Drive, and it worked great. And then I discovered as Google changed their technologies, there's a little animosity between these companies. They're like, wait a second, why should we let Microsoft Visual Studio write temporary files to Google Drive? No. So they kind of stopped that and discovered the hard way that it wasn't working, saving my stuff to Google Drive, which was my normal operating paradigm. But saving it to OneDrive worked great. And so that's what I started doing whenever I work with an IDE. So the principle is it's still a cloud drive. It's just a Microsoft one. It makes sense it would work. But I feel more comfortable that way because I know that if something happens to my computer, that way I can always know that my code is out in the cloud and I can get to it somehow, somewhere, get a different machine, load up Visual Studio, there it is, I'm all good, right? And so that's what I'm going to use as my repository. What you choose to use is really up to you. Now I have a secondary problem here. Yeah, this one is, I haven't set up OneDrive on this machine yet. So, hey, let's demonstrate this too while we're at it. So I'm going to go through the process here of logging in. And remember before I said I don't remember what my password is. I'm hoping it's kind of automatic here. Oh, great. Check your internet connection. Oh, no. Right, because and the reason is, all right, well, okay, did it anyhow. Don't know what that was about, folks, but you can see it's putting it in my OneDrive. I'm just going to, sure, thanks, next. Oh, I see what it did. It recognized that I'm on the enterprise domain, and it gave me a gateway OneDrive. This is a separate one here. No, and here's a helpful tip. I'm not a fan of Windows automatically backing up my stuff to the cloud. I'm already taking care of that, you know. But for a lot of us using modern versions of Windows and the Mac OS, by the way, this is kind of automatic now on the Mac. They take like your desktop, your docs and stuff, and they automatically push it to iCloud. Now on Windows, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, their primary save location is not even on their own computer, it's in the cloud. Personally, I'm not comfortable with that, so I'm going to uncheck all of these. You guys might choose otherwise. You might like that feature, but don't get confused when you're looking for your files. Always go to OneDrive. That's where they are. All right, so you see that I unchecked those, so I'm skipping that. And yeah, I think I kind of know it already. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm not going to get the mobile app. I already have it, actually. I'm going to open my OneDrive folder and take a look. And you can see it's pulling up all my OneDrive stuff from my gateway OneDrive. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do before I go ahead and go back to Visual Studio, I am going to create a folder here where all my work's going to go. And I want to use a file architecture that makes sense to me. For me, you know, frankly, I'm going to probably just give it the course number. And that's just my pattern for storing my files for courses, because I know what those numbers are. And I'll say asp.net. So one grand folder for the whole class. And then inside that folder, see, I work on a semester basis, so I'm going to create a summer 2021 folder. And then all the code I create for this instance of this class will go into that folder. So it's pre-created. Yes, I could have created the folder from the other interface, but hey, I did it this way, whatever, right? Horseshoes and hand grenades, folks. All right, so now I'm going to change that file save location. I am going to go to my gateway OneDrive, asp.net, summer 2021. This is where my project's going to reside and all the projects that I create for this class. So I'm going to select this folder. And then I want you to notice that I'm naming the project. And then there's this secondary piece that we create called a solution. All right. And the best way I can really describe a solution is to say that a solution is a way that you can point to various project assets, including other projects. All right, so that sounds a little confusing, but it's basically a file that gets added to the folder that allows you to take all the resources of the project and get them all pointed to, so that when you fire up the project, you know that everything's there, right? And in some circumstances, you can just double click that file and the whole thing opens up. And some cases, when we create these solution files, we put them in the same folder as the project we're creating, if it's a simple project, or if it's a project that's going to have many different projects embedded. So sometimes programs are collections of programs. We place the solution file one folder level above so it can point to all of the projects. In this case, it's a simple project, don't need to do that. So I'm going to choose place solution and project in the same directory because it's a simple project. If it was complicated, I would not do that. We can also select the framework, meaning the version of the Microsoft Common Runtime libraries that we're using to generate the executable files. And you should use whatever the latest one is that's listed on here, almost by rule, you know. unless you have a very particular reason not to. You will notice that our book is .NET 4.5.1. And so, yes, there have been version increases, but not a major version increase. So they're not on .NET 5 yet, but we're on .NET 4.7. It's not really that far removed from what we are, have in the book. All right, so once that selection is made, all three of those selections, so project name, that makes sense, a folder save location, that makes sense, put the solution and project in the same directory, and then .NET 4.72, the latest stable version production. And we'll go ahead and click create. And now we get presented with this screen. And this is where it kind of gets kind of interesting, because the book really does diverge here. When we get into, especially the second course, we will play a lot with these like MVC and APIs and blah, blah, blah. I do also want you to notice, and, my people who are on other platforms, by the way, that you can also, like if you're building a project here, you can also build in Docker support. So if you want to deploy it on a Linux system inside of Docker, there you go. It gives you the whole framework to just put it right in. It's just a checkbox. All right, so we have these selections here, and I want you to notice some of the choices that we have. So we can create a website that is empty, all right? We can create one that uses web forms, which is the most common way to create .NET websites is to create web forms. And what that really means is there's a recognition in application development that a majority of the work that we do in application development is centered around content being entered into forms. Usernames, passwords, checkboxes, buttons, slider bars, those kind of things. So that's one of the primary things we do. Then we have the MVC approach, where the application really gets split into little pieces for efficiency's sake, and is a very modern approach. We also have the Web API approach, which uses some of the, basically the RESTful architecture that comes with HTML5. And then you also have what some of you may have learned already with in some of our, like maybe Web 2 class or Angular React classes, building single page apps, where the whole website is really just one page and you're just kind of bopping around it. And those are all available as pre-built templates. Now, I forget if the book is asking us to do, yeah, so they want web forms. So you guys see that right here. Click ASP.NET Web Forms. And so let's do that. Let's make that selection. So we're choosing web forms, and I'm just bouncing back there to see, is there anything else that we really want to have selected? Where you're storing it, I guess we already figured that out. All right, so there we go. So that's the only selection we need to make here, and none of the other stuff. The other thing that I might encourage you to uncheck, at least for right now, because we're not going to deploy this, by the way, we're just doing a sample website. See, there's a little checkbox here for configuring HTTPS. So I can add, secure socket layers or encryption to my website with the click of a button here. So when I would deploy it directly to an HTTPS, enabled website that has secure socket layers enabled and installed and the certificate is valid, I can add all the tools that help to make that truly secure on the server side with that checkbox. However, all right, so here's the big however, this adds a lot of overhead. And so it'll add a lot of binaries and executables and all these like weird things that make the website truly secure. Way overkill for what, for doing hello world. So I am unchecking that. That will make my project drop from, many megabytes in size to like, just a pittance, basically. So I'm unchecking that particular tool. Web Forms is selected. I'm clicking on Create. So now we're letting the tool build out an ASP.NET C# website built on .NET with the 4.72 framework. I'm trying to remember all the terminology here. Using a Web Forms template, which basically creates a bunch of stuff for us automatically in advance. And the first thing you're going to notice as it loads up is, holy cow, look at the Solution Explorer filled up with a whole bunch of stuff. And it's a lot, right? There's a whole bunch of things here. And it looks like it's more than just files and folders. And that's correct. It is. And we will explore these interfaces in depth. So we're not going to try to do it all tonight, but I just want to show you that it pre-created a bunch of pages, folders, and other stuff. Some folders have stuff in them, right? Some don't. And you know what? You should kind of poke around and look at what was just created. I mean, I barely did a darn thing aside from name a file or two, and it just built out a whole darn thing for me. And I'm looking for index.html, but I'm not finding it. Right? Okay. So, and you're not going to. In fact, you're not finding any HTML files. You'll notice that the primary, you know, suffix or file extension for any of the pages that we create in a .NET ASP.NET environment are going to have the extension of .aspx, right? And if it was just .asp, then you're looking at classic ASP pages, and they would be parsed as classic ASP pages. Add the X to it, and that means we are using ASP.NET. I want you to also notice, and we will explore this in detail later on, that some files and folders have little expander arrows next to them. And if you click those, you'll notice that this default ASPX file, which you notice I clicked on it and it came up in the code window. It's like, wow, there's a whole bunch of code already in here. Yeah, they've already coded out. And you guys are noticing a lot of that is regular HTML. You see paragraphs and divs, and there's an H2 in there and whatever, classes and IDs and links. But you'll also notice that there's this other file attached to it with the same name. So default.aspx.cs, which is C#, which means the programming code that sits behind that page. All right, so what that means is when this page loads up on the server, this code file would also execute. Now, this is the code version, but when we compile our application, when it gets pushed to the server, this turns into a binary, and whatever's programmed in here will automatically run while my page loads. So I want you to think about what we're talking about here. We have a separation of the programming code from basically what I would call the presentation layer or the visual aspect of the HTML. So the ASPX page puts the content on the page, right? The structure, the HTML structure, you know, all that stuff. And it's got program code that sits behind it, which is, you know, one of the areas we're going to play with. And then there's also this other area that allows you to do designer code. And this, you know, for right now, we won't even touch this. Our book doesn't really cover this because this is kind of a brand new feature. But what this really is another way to add programming code that's separated. But as you can imagine, it says designer. It is more geared towards the interface than it is towards the functionality of the code. Now, as you kind of look at an anatomy of a page like this, it becomes a little bit weird. So I'm going to do a little bit of a zoom in here so you can see some of the code. And you'll notice that first thing, you know, the HTML people are like, where's the doc type? Right? Where's the HTML tags, you know? But what really is happening is that's somewhere else, right? Think of like includes in PHP, because that stuff's somewhere else, but it's still there. Then we get to this ASP tag, and really bizarre looking. I've never seen a tag like this before. It says ASP:content, and it's got an ID and some other stuff, right? Then inside there is all the stuff that goes on the page. This stuff looks like regular HTML. It's not mysterious or anything like that. I can predict kind of what that's going to do. All right. You know what? This is a really good time to launch this, and that's kind of what the book does next. is they kind of show you the interface and any, the stuff that you're working with. But I'm going to come up here and I want you to notice that um, there's a green play button, which a lot of our IDEs have. And the reason they have this is how you launch it to do whatever it's supposed to do. If there's code in the background, it will compile it. If there's errors, it will show you what the errors are. And then ultimately, it will launch the thing. So if it's a web application, it'll bring up a browser and show you the web page. If it's a Windows application, it'll launch in Windows, etc. We're building a web application. That's what we chose. And so the default play points us to IIS Express Google Chrome. So I need to explain this to you, what this is doing. IIS Express stands for Internet Information Server. And that is basically Windows version of a web server, which serves web pages to people visiting websites. And there is the full-blown version built into every pro level of Windows. So there's another tool that you added with Windows Education, by the way. You just made your thing your computer a web server. But we're using the Express version, which is the built-in web server that's directly in Visual Studio. You didn't have to install it, it's just there, right? And you know what? It's great for development because I don't have to run a separate server or run like XAMPP or LAMP or any of those tools. It's just built in, it just launches the web page. It also tells you where it's going to broadcast to, which is to Google Chrome by default. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to launch. You see the output window comes up. And you notice it says build started. So it's trying to compile all the code in the background if it needs to be. And then if there's no errors, if there was an error, it would stop me dead in my tracks. But now it's launching in the background the built-in development server. So it's like launching another piece of software in the background. And then it's serving the web page to my browser. And this is what I created. And I just want you to just sit and look at this for a second. You go, wow, that looks nice. Right? I hope that's what you're doing. It's like, and the layout's good, the typography's good. I even kind of like the colors, and there's like a button, and I didn't do any of this. And here's the website name that would take me back to home, but there's a home, there's an about, and a contact. Can I click on these? Well, sure. Right? And they just figure most websites have a home page, an about page, and a contact page. And if you want, you can get rid of them. And it's kind of already set up, and it kind of looks okay. And this is built directly into the template. Now, many of us will go, "Oh, that's not even coding, right? I just hit a couple buttons and it just did all the work for me." Well, yeah, but this is a boring website. But you have a starting point that looks nice. And the truth is, what it did in the background is it had layouts in place. It's using Bootstrap to do the CSS and the layout and all the columns and the responsiveness, and a bunch of other JavaScript libraries and stuff automatically included in the project. And the thinking is, here's your basic framework, now customize and do that. We will play a little bit with this, and if you're doing your own project, this might be a perfectly valid way of launching a project. In other cases, you might want to start from scratch and not have any of this stuff pre-built, and we will look at both approaches for doing this. But you have to admit, for really hardly any work, you got a website up and running, and you're looking at it already. And what the heck did we do? Now, granted, we didn't do the hello world part, right? And so why don't we go ahead and do the whole hello world part? I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to close this browser for right now. I'm going to do the hello world aspect of it. And really what they're asking us to do here is go ahead and take all the stuff between those ASP tags on the default page and just replace it with this. And there's a couple of things embedded in here. So let's just do this first. Yes, I'm copying it right from the book. I'll paste that code into the chat. I don't know how elegant it will be, but there it is if you don't want to type it. Oh, you see what it did? It stripped out the HTML tags. Okay, never mind. You'll have to type it, sorry. I guess I could do code share too, but I'm a little lazy right now to do that. So I'm going to go back to my IDE now. And what it's asking us to do is remove everything between these ASP tags. So I'm just going to select it all and remove. And there's the closing ASP tag here at the bottom. I'm going to leave that in place. I'm just going to blow that away. And then I'm just going to paste in that code that I grabbed from the book. And you notice it's not transferring any of the HTML. And that's why I always use the PDF. So now I remember. So we need H2s around hello world. So let's do that. That's not too hard to do. I think we can handle that. And then right away, you're kind of getting the feel for the IDE. So those of you that are familiar with working with Visual Studio Code, a lot of the keystrokes and stuff really work very much the same. So you'll be comfortable there. And then I believe this one was a paragraph. Is that right? And I'm just verifying that all of that goes inside of a paragraph tag. So that my closing one's here. We'll put that here. Now, one interesting thing that got embedded in here. So we're blowing away the default HTML that came with, and now we're adding in our own HTML. Got to do our hello world. So we got an H2 here and a paragraph. And then we have here a little example of classic ASP code. So this is, you know, and you notice how like the brackets and the percent signs are highlighted yellow here. So this is a kind of equivalent to like when you put a script tag in for JavaScript. You put a script tag in and then you drop in your code. Or with PHP, you do the question mark PHP, put in your code, question mark, bracket, you're closed. So with ASP, classic ASP, you can do that with this delimiter, which is the percent sign. So HTML style brackets with percent signs on the opening and closing. And then every once in a while, they added an additional character. What that additional character means is we're pushing this back. We're pushing something into the browser is what that's saying, rather than just running code. Now, it doesn't take much to figure out what this is doing with all your programming experience now. We're calling upon the datetime library. Guess what that does? What datetime are we talking about? Now. That's pretty easy to figure out too. And we're taking whatever is generated by that method and we're converting it to a string so we can output it to the browser in layman's term. Now we're going to do the same thing we did before, is we're going to run this. So I'm going to hit the run button here. And there it goes, launching the page. And because I've already run the web server once, this is going to be a little bit faster. And now you see the result of what I just created. More interestingly, let's take a look at the output code because it clearly did the H2 and it looks fine, right? We're using the Bootstrap CSS, by the way, it's just built in. And then our paragraph. And then here's the result of that classic ASP statement. But if we actually look at the page source on this, I think this is where it gets interesting because what of this did we create? You know, this is, you know, like the first thing I ask people is, what did we create? Well, like none of it, really. You know, the couple lines that we just dropped in, all of this happens automatically. So now here's our doc type, right? We got our doc type. All the stuff that we see is like pretty standard in an HTML document. But now you're starting to see, once you get past that, like the head section here and into some of the links, you know, we can see the Bootstrap CSS, and there's some other CSS file, and a favorite icon. I guess I didn't even notice that I had one, and this thing called the Modernizer. You know, we'll talk about that one. Very common for .NET applications. It basically allows this application to work inside of Internet Explorer, which now we kind of don't care about, but it's there. And then we get into the content on the page, and once again, this is not at all what we put on the content of the page ourselves. In fact, the part that we put in, heck, where the hell, oh, there it is, way down at the bottom. But you'll notice that, you know, all the stuff that's at the top of the page, you know, the menus and sort of a footer, I guess, all that stuff's embedded in here. Some of it by virtue of script, some of it by virtue of different types of tools that are built into this platform. But pretty interesting to look at because we created None of it, right? This is all part of the template. And this is how lots of pros work, folks. They work with systems like this where the initial framework is pre-generated and they're just feeding in the content. And you know what? When you're trying to build something quickly and deploy it and get it out there and it works and it looks good, what does it matter, right? And then you can always tweak the looks later. But this is, the proof is in the pudding, looking at the output, and this is what is created. So I think that's always important when you're working with these server-side technologies is what is this technology doing and what is it actually pushing to the browser? So now when you go to a web page, you're like, wow, this is really cool. How did they do it? Right-click View Source, and you start to see things that look like this. You very quickly can start to go, oh, I know how they did this, and see that's part of the education of this too. But this is the hello world exercise from the first chapter, and they show it to you here on the screen. All right. I'm going to pause here for a sec.